The cathedral doors slammed shut, and every candle in the room seemed to flicker at once. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the altar in a gown of pale silver silk, her hands trembling inside long white gloves. Hundreds of guests filled the pews behind her, their whispers rising like smoke toward the high stone ceiling. She had waited 3 years for this day. She had not expected it to end like this. Duke Alexander Ashworth stood across from her, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. He did not look like a man about to marry the woman his family had chosen for him. He looked like a man about to destroy her. "I cannot do this," he said, loud enough for the entire cathedral to hear. The priest froze, his prayer book still open in his hands. Somewhere in the crowd a woman gasped. Eleanor felt her heart drop into her stomach, but she did not move. She had been raised to hold her composure no matter what happened, and she held it now, even as the man in front of her tore her future apart in front of everyone she had ever known. "Alexander," she whispered, so only he could hear, "please, not like this." He did not answer her. Instead, he turned to face the crowd, his voice growing louder, harder, crueler with every word. "I will not marry a woman I was forced to accept," he said. "This marriage was arranged by our fathers to save this family's fortune. I refuse to spend my life bound to a stranger simply because my father made a deal behind my back." The words landed like stones. Eleanor felt her face grow hot, then cold, then numb. She could see her mother in the front row, her hand pressed against her mouth. She could see her father rising halfway out of his seat, his face turning red with anger and shame. She could see Lady Beatrice Hartley, the most notorious gossip in the entire county, leaning forward with wide, delighted eyes, already composing the story she would tell at every dinner party for the next decade. Eleanor looked at Alexander one more time. She searched his face for some sign of regret, some flicker of the man she had believed, for 3 long years of correspondence and careful courtship, might one day love her. She found nothing. His eyes were fixed somewhere past her shoulder, somewhere far away, as if she were already gone from his mind. "You could have told me this before we reached the altar," she said quietly. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. "I am telling you now," he said. The cruelty of it settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Around her the ripples spread outward, touching every person in the room. She heard the whispers grow louder. She heard someone laugh, quickly muffled. She heard her mother begin to cry. Eleanor did the only thing she could do. She lifted the hem of her gown, turned away from the altar, and began to walk down the aisle, back the way she had come, back through the crowd of people who had gathered to watch her become a duchess, and were now watching her become something else entirely. A cautionary tale, a punish line. A woman publicly refused at her own wedding. She did not run. She did not cry, not yet, not where anyone could see. She walked with her chin lifted and her shoulders straight, though every step felt like walking across broken glass in bare feet. She could feel the eyes of the entire county following her, weighing her, already deciding how this story would be told by morning. Outside the cathedral, the air was cold and sharp, and for a moment Eleanor simply stood on the stone steps, breathing, trying to remember how to exist in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. Her carriage waited at the bottom of the steps, the horses stamping impatiently in the November chill. She walked toward it slowly, aware that curious faces were already pressed against the windows of nearby houses, watching the bride who had just been left standing. Her father caught up to her before she reached the carriage, his face a mixture of fury and heartbreak. "Eleanor, I am so sorry," he said. "I did not know he would do this. I swear to you I did not know." "I believe you," Eleanor said. And she did. Arthur Whitmore was not a cruel man. He had arranged this marriage because their family's finances had grown thin, and a connection to the Ashworth name had seemed, at the time, like the answer to every prayer he had whispered in the dark. He had not known his daughter would be humiliated in front of the entire county for his mistake. "We will find a way to fix this," her father said, though his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor shook her head. "There is nothing to fix, father. It is done. Everyone saw it happen. There is no undoing what has already been witnessed by 300 people." She climbed into the carriage without waiting for his response, and a moment later her mother joined her, still dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Margaret Whitmore reached for her daughter's hand, but Alina pulled it gently away. "Please, mother, not now. I need a moment before I can bear to be comforted." The carriage pulled away from the cathedral, and Alina watched through the small window as the crowd spilled out onto the steps behind them, already breaking into small clusters of conversation, already beginning to spread the story that would reach every corner of the county before the sun set. She watched the cathedral grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind a bend in the road, and only then did she allow herself to close her eyes. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry, not in front of her mother, not in front of the driver, not in front of anyone. She would allow herself that release later, alone, in the privacy of her own room, where no one could see the cracks forming in the composure she had built her entire life around. The ride home felt endless. Margaret tried twice more to speak, and twice more Alina asked for silence, and eventually her mother gave up and simply stared out the opposite window, her own thoughts likely circling the same question that echoed through Alina's mind. What happens now? What does a woman do in a world built entirely around marriage and reputation, when she has just been rejected by her own groom in front of everyone who matters? When they arrived home, Alina did not go to her room immediately. She stood in the entrance hall of the house she had grown up in, still wearing her wedding gown, and looked around at the familiar furniture, the family portraits, the small cracks in the plaster that no one had ever bothered to repair. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, when she had woken with hope in her chest and excitement humming through her veins. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing would ever be the same again. Grace, the family's longtime maid, appeared in the hallway, her eyes widening at the sight of Alina standing alone in her wedding dress. "Miss Alina," she said softly, "what happened?" "The wedding did not happen," Alina said, her voice flat and even. "The Duke changed his mind." Grace's face fell, but she did not press for more details. Instead, she stepped forward and gently began unfastening the small pearl buttons at the back of Alina's gown, the same gown Alina had chosen with such care only weeks before, imagining the moment she would walk down that aisle and become a duchess. "Would you like a bath drawn, miss?" "Yes," Alina said. "Thank you, Grace." She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, and once she was alone in her room, the door closed firmly behind her, she finally allowed the tears to come. She sat on the edge of her bed, still half wrapped in silver silk, and cried until her chest ached and her throat burned, until every ounce of the humiliation she had swallowed in front of that cathedral full of witnesses came pouring out in the privacy of her own room. But even as she cried, something else was beginning to form beneath the grief. A quiet, hard resolve, small as a seed but already taking root. She would not spend the rest of her life defined by the moment a man had refused her at the altar. She would not become the tragic story that Lady Beatrice Hartley told at every dinner party for years to come. She did not yet know what she would become instead, but she knew, with sudden and startling clarity, that she would become something. By the time Grace returned to tell her the bath was ready, Alina had wiped her face clean and risen from the bed. Her eyes were red, but her posture had returned to its familiar, unshakable straightness. "Thank you, Grace," she said again. "I believe I would also like some tea and paper. I have letters to write." Grace hesitated. "Tonight, miss, after everything that happened." "Especially tonight," Alina said. "There is no better time to begin." She did not yet know what those letters would become, or what path they would set her upon. She only knew that she refused to spend one more moment as the woman the Duke had rejected. Somewhere in the wreckage of that afternoon, a different Alina Whitmore was beginning to take shape, one who would answer humiliation not with despair, but with quiet, deliberate purpose. The cathedral doors had closed on one version of her life. She intended to open new ones herself. Downstairs, her father sat alone in his study, staring at the unopened bottle of wine he had bought weeks earlier to celebrate the wedding. He did not pour a glass. He simply stared at it, turning it slowly in the candlelight, thinking of the letter he had signed months before, the letter that had promised his daughter's hand in exchange for a debt he could no longer manage on his own. He had believed the arrangement would secure her future. Instead, he had handed her over to a man who did not want her, and the entire county now knew it. Margaret found him there an hour later, her own eyes still swollen from crying. She said nothing at first, only crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. "She will survive this," Margaret said quietly. "Our daughter is stronger than either of us gives her credit for." Arthur did not answer. He only nodded, though the guilt sat heavy in his chest, a weight he suspected would remain there for a very long time. Upstairs, Alina sat at her small writing desk, a fresh sheet of paper in front of her, an inkwell open beside it. She dipped her pen and began to write, not a letter of grief or apology, but a list. A list of everything she knew how to do, every skill she had quietly gathered over the years, while everyone around her assumed she was simply waiting to become someone's wife. She wrote of the garden she had tended since childhood, the flowers she had learned to grow and blend into fragrances that made visitors linger in her mother's parlor. She wrote of the accounts she had helped balance for her father's small estate, the numbers she understood better than he did, though he had never once asked for her opinion. By the time the candle burned low, the page in front of her was full. Alina looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the drawer of her desk, where it would wait until morning, until she had the strength to decide what to do with it. Somewhere beyond the cathedral, beyond the whispers already spreading through the county, a new chapter was beginning to write itself, one page at a time. 3 weeks before the wedding, Alexander Ashworth had stood in his father's study, listening to a conversation that would shape everything that followed. "The estate cannot survive another winter without new funds," Edward Ashworth said, his voice tired in a way Alexander had never heard before. His father had always seemed unshakable, a man built of stone and duty, but that evening he looked smaller, older, worn down by years of quiet financial ruin he had hidden from his own son. "How bad is it?" Alexander asked. "Bad enough that if the Whitmore marriage does not proceed, we will lose this house within the year, perhaps sooner." Alexander had known his family's fortune had thinned in recent years, but he had not understood the scale of it until that moment. He had not understood that his father had already signed an agreement, promising Alexander's hand to Alina Whitmore in exchange for the dowry that would keep their creditors at bay. He had not been consulted. He had simply been informed, as though his own future were a business transaction his father had negotiated on his behalf without ever once asking what he wanted. What Edward did not know, what Alexander had told no one, was that his heart already belonged to someone else. For nearly 2 years, he had been quietly courting Lady Cassandra Blackwood, a woman his father considered unsuitable, from a family with a title but little land and even less money. Their meetings had been careful, secretive, arranged through mutual friends and coded letters, because Cassandra understood, as well as Alexander did, that Edward Ashworth would never approve of a match that brought no fortune with it. Cassandra was everything Alina Whitmore was not, or at least everything Alexander believed her to be at the time. She was bold where Alina was composed, dramatic where Alina was measured, and she filled every room she entered with a kind of restless, magnetic energy that Alexander mistook for passion. When he was with her, he felt alive in a way he had never felt during his brief, formal meetings with Alina, meetings arranged by their families, chaperoned and stiff, conducted more like business appointments than courtship. "Marry her for the money if you must," Cassandra had told him only days before the wedding, her voice sharp with barely concealed anger. "But do not expect me to wait patiently while you play the dutiful son." "I have no choice," Alexander had said. "My father has already signed the agreement. If I refuse, we lose everything." "Then find another way," Cassandra said. "Refuse her instead, publicly if you must. Let the Whitmores absorb the humiliation of a broken engagement instead of binding yourself to a woman you do not love." Alexander had not agreed immediately. He had spent long nights turning the idea over in his mind, weighing his father's desperate need for the Whitmore dowry against his own desperate need to keep Cassandra in his life. He told himself, in those quiet hours, that refusing Alina publicly would spare her the slow, private misery of a loveless marriage. He told himself he was doing her a kindness, sparing her years of a husband who would never truly belong to her. It was a lie he found easy to believe, because believing it meant he did not have to face the truth. The truth was simpler and far less noble. He wanted Cassandra, and he was willing to destroy another woman's reputation in front of hundreds of witnesses to keep the smallest chance of having her. On the morning of the wedding, Alexander had dressed in silence, his valet Lucas watching him with quiet concern. "You do not have to go through with any of it," Lucas said carefully, buttoning the final clasp of Alexander's coat. "There are quieter ways to end an engagement than standing at the altar and refusing her in front of the entire county." "There is no time for quiet ways," Alexander said. "The invitations are sent. The guests are already arriving. If I do not end this today, I will spend the rest of my life bound to a woman I never chose. And if you humiliate her today, you will spend the rest of your life known as the man who did it," Lucas said. "That reputation follows a person longer than you might think." Alexander did not answer. He simply straightened his cravat in the mirror and walked out of the room, already rehearsing the words he would say, already convincing himself that cruelty delivered quickly was somehow kinder than cruelty delivered slowly over the span of a marriage neither of them wanted. What he had not planned for, what no amount of rehearsal had prepared him for, was the look on Alina's face when he turned to the crowd and spoke the words that ended everything. He had expected anger, perhaps tears, perhaps even a scene to match his own. What he received instead was silence, and a composure so complete it unsettled him more than any outburst could have. She had not screamed. She had not collapsed. She had simply looked at him with an expression he could not name, something between disbelief and quiet devastation, and then she had turned and walked away with her spine straight and her chin lifted, as though refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her break. That image stayed with him long after the cathedral had emptied. He returned home that evening to find his father waiting in the entrance hall, his face pale with fury. "Do you understand what you have done?" Edward demanded. "Do you understand what this will cost us?" "I understand," Alexander said, though in truth, standing in the cold entrance hall of his family home, he was beginning to understand less and less with every passing hour. "The Whitmores will withdraw their support entirely. There is no possibility of renegotiation now, not after what you did in front of 300 witnesses. You have not simply ended an engagement, Alexander. You have destroyed this family's last chance at survival." Alexander said nothing. There was nothing to say that would undo the words he had already spoken, the humiliation he had already delivered, the reputation he had already shattered, both his own and Alina's. He went to Cassandra that night, expecting comfort, expecting gratitude for the sacrifice he believed he had made on her behalf. Instead, he found her cool and distracted, her attention already drifting toward the letters scattered across her writing desk, correspondence from a wealthy widower who had recently begun paying her considerable attention. "You did it then," she said, barely glancing up. "Good, that settles that." "That settles that?" Alexander repeated, something cold beginning to form in his chest. "Cassandra, I gave up everything today, my father's trust, my family's fortune, my own reputation, all of it." "You did what needed doing," Cassandra said, finally looking up at him, her expression unreadable. "I never asked you to ruin yourself for me, Alexander. I asked you not to marry someone else." The distinction, small as it seemed in that moment, would haunt him in the months to come. He had convinced himself he was fighting for love. He was only beginning to suspect, standing in Cassandra's parlor while she barely looked at him, that he had fought for something far more fragile and far less certain than he had believed. He left her townhouse that night and walked the empty streets alone, his mind circling back, again and again, to the image of Alina Whitmore turning away from the altar with her head held high. He told himself he had made the right choice. He told himself the marriage would have been a slow misery for them both, and that he had spared her a lifetime of quiet unhappiness by ending things quickly, however cruelly. But somewhere beneath the justification, a smaller, quieter voice was beginning to ask a question he was not yet ready to answer. What if he had been wrong, not about the marriage, but about which woman deserved his loyalty in the first place? He did not know, as he walked home through the cold November night, that within a year his family's fortunes would crumble entirely, that Cassandra would vanish from his life the moment his usefulness to her ended, and that the woman he had humiliated in front of the entire county would rebuild her life so completely that he would barely recognize her when their paths crossed again. He knew only that he had made a choice, and that choices, once spoken aloud in front of 300 witnesses, could not be quietly taken back. The following morning, letters began arriving at the Ashworth estate, each one worse than the last. Creditors who had extended patience because of the promised Whitmore dowry now demanded immediate payment. Business partners who had trusted Edward Ashworth's word withdrew their support, unwilling to be associated with a family whose son had humiliated a bride in front of half the county. Invitations to social events that had once arrived daily slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. The Ashworth name, once respected throughout the region, had become something people whispered about behind closed doors, a cautionary tale told at dinner parties much the same way Alina's humiliation was told. Alexander watched his father grow grayer and more withdrawn with each passing week, watched the great house grow colder as fewer and fewer rooms could be afforded proper heating, watched the servants they could no longer pay quietly find positions elsewhere. He had believed, in the moment he refused Alina at the altar, that he was choosing freedom. He was beginning to understand, slowly and painfully, that he had chosen something else entirely, something that felt less like freedom and more like the slow unraveling of everything his family had spent generations building. He thought of Alina often in those difficult weeks, though he told no one, not even Lucas. He wondered what had become of her, whether she had retreated entirely from society, whether she blamed him as much as he now privately, quietly, blamed himself. He did not yet know that while his own world was collapsing, Alina Whitmore was quietly, deliberately, building something new from the wreckage he had left behind, something that would eventually force their paths to cross again, on terms neither of them could have predicted on the day he left her standing alone at the altar. Lady Beatrice Hartley, true to her nature, made certain the story spread far beyond the county within days. She told it at every tea, every card game, every chance meeting on the street, embellishing small details each time until the tale of the Duke's cruel refusal had grown into something closer to legend than memory. In her telling, Alina became either a tragic victim or a woman who had somehow deserved her fate, depending on which version suited the audience she addressed that particular afternoon. Alexander, meanwhile, became something worse than a villain in most versions. He became a joke, a cautionary example mothers used to warn their daughters about trusting a man's promises too easily. He heard fragments of these stories wherever he went, in the pointed silence that fell over rooms when he entered, in the way old acquaintances suddenly found urgent business elsewhere rather than greet him. He had expected consequences. He had not expected the particular loneliness of being spoken about constantly while being spoken to less and less. His father summoned him again a week after the wedding, this time not with anger but with a kind of exhausted resignation that Alexander found harder to bear than fury. "I have spent the last 7 days trying to find another path forward," Edward said, seated heavily behind his desk, surrounded by ledgers he could no longer make sense of no matter how many hours he studied them. "There is no other family willing to consider a match now. Word travels fast, Alexander, and it has traveled faster than I could have imagined." "I will find work," Alexander said, though even as he spoke the words, he understood how hollow they sounded. Dukes did not simply find work. Their entire lives had been built around an inheritance that assumed money would always be present, that titles alone would open every door necessary. He had no trade, no profession, nothing beyond the education of a gentleman who had never expected to need anything more. "Work," Edward repeated, something almost like a laugh escaping him, though there was no humor in it. And what work would a disgraced duke find exactly? Who would hire the man half the county now refuses to speak with directly? Alexander had no answer. He stood in his father's study, surrounded by the weight of consequences he had not fully understood until they arrived, and for the first time since the wedding, doubt began to creep past the justifications he had built so carefully in his own mind. He had told himself he was choosing love over duty, freedom over obligation. He was beginning to suspect he had simply traded one kind of unhappiness for another, and dragged his entire family into the trade alongside him. That night, alone in his room, Alexander opened a small drawer in his desk and removed a single letter, one Elinor had written him months earlier during their brief and formal courtship. It was not a passionate letter. It was practical, thoughtful, filled with careful questions about his interests and gentle observations about her own. He had read it once, quickly, and set it aside without much thought at the time, too preoccupied with Cassandra to notice the quiet intelligence woven through every line. Reading it again now, in the wreckage of everything that had followed, he found himself lingering over sentences he had barely registered before, wondering, for the first time, who exactly he had refused at that altar, and what he might have discovered about her had he ever bothered to truly look. He told himself the thought meant nothing. He told himself he was simply searching for reasons to ease his own guilt, nothing more. But the letter remained on his desk long after he should have put it away, and in the weeks that followed, as his family's fortunes continued to crumble and Cassandra's attention drifted further and further from him, he found himself returning to it more than once, each time understanding a little less about the choice he had made, and a little more about the woman he had made it against. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, Elinor Whitmore stood in a small greenhouse behind her family's estate, surrounded by rows of blooming lavender, roses, and delicate white jasmine. The scent hung thick and sweet in the warm air, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to peace. In the weeks following her humiliation, Elinor had retreated from society almost entirely. She declined invitations to teas and dinners, avoided the shops on the main street where she knew whispers would follow her, and spent her days instead in the one place that had always brought her comfort, the garden her grandmother had planted decades earlier. What had once been a simple hobby blending flowers into fragrances for her mother's small dinner parties slowly became something more deliberate. She began experimenting with different combinations, testing which blooms held their scent longest, which oils extracted most cleanly, which fragrances lingered pleasantly on skin and fabric rather than fading within an hour. Her mother had worried at first that Elinor's retreat into the greenhouse was simply another form of hiding, a way of avoiding the world rather than facing it. "You cannot spend the rest of your life among the flowers, Elinor," Margaret said one afternoon, watching her daughter carefully measure rose oil into a small glass vial. "Society will forget eventually. You must rejoin it when you are ready." "I am not hiding, Mother," Elinor said without looking up from her work. "I am building something." Margaret did not understand at first what her daughter meant. Elinor did not explain further, not because she wished to be secretive, but because she herself did not yet fully understand the shape of what she was building. She only knew that each small vial of fragrance she completed gave her a sense of purpose she had not felt since the wedding, a feeling that she was creating something entirely her own, something no one could take from her with a single cruel sentence spoken in front of a crowd. The idea to sell her fragrances came almost by accident. Charlotte Ashby, Elinor's closest friend since childhood, visited one afternoon and noticed a small vial of Elinor's newest blend sitting on the windowsill of the greenhouse. "What is this?" Charlotte asked, lifting the vial and breathing in the scent. Her eyes widened immediately. "Elinor, this is extraordinary. I have never smelled anything quite like it." "It is only something I have been experimenting with," Elinor said, though a small flush of pride warmed her cheeks at her friend's reaction. "You should sell it," Charlotte said immediately. "I would pay for this myself, and I know at least a dozen women who would do the same." Elinor laughed at first, dismissing the idea as impossible. A woman of her standing did not simply open a shop and sell perfumes like a common merchant. It was not done. It was not proper. But the idea, once spoken aloud, refused to leave her mind entirely. She found herself thinking about it during quiet moments in the greenhouse, turning the possibility over and over, weighing the scandal of such an unconventional pursuit against the quiet satisfaction she felt every time she completed a new blend. The truth, which Alina slowly began to accept in the weeks that followed, was that her reputation had already been damaged beyond ordinary repair. The wedding humiliation had already marked her as unconventional, as someone whose story did not follow the expected path. If she was already the subject of whispered gossip regardless of what she did next, perhaps there was a strange kind of freedom in that. Perhaps she had less to lose than a woman whose reputation remained intact, and more room, therefore, to attempt something the rest of society would never dare. She began small, offering her fragrances quietly to friends and acquaintances, never charging much, simply testing whether her work held value beyond her own greenhouse. The response surprised her. Women who had once whispered about her disastrous wedding began instead whispering about the remarkable scent she wore, asking where she had acquired it, whether more could be obtained. Slowly, carefully, Alina began to understand that she held a genuine skill, one that had nothing to do with marriage or family connections or the approval of any duke. Her father, when he learned of her small venture, reacted with a mixture of concern and quiet admiration. "This is not the life I imagined for you," Arthur said one evening, watching Alina carefully label a row of finished vials at the kitchen table. "It is not the life I imagined for myself either," Alina admitted. "But it is a life I am building with my own hands, father. No one can take that from me the way it was taken before." Arthur said nothing for a long moment, studying his daughter's face, seeing in her expression a determination he had not noticed in her before, or perhaps had simply never had reason to look for. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said finally. "She always said this garden held more value than anyone gave it credit for." With her parents' cautious blessing, Alina began to expand her small venture. She rented a modest storefront in the nearby town, using savings she had carefully set aside over the years, money her father had once assumed she would spend on wedding preparations that never came to pass. She named the shop Whitmore Blooms, and though the sign above the door was small and simple, the fragrances inside quickly earned a reputation of their own. The early months were not easy. Many of the county's most prominent families refused to shop at an establishment run by a woman still associated with public scandal, and Alina endured more than a few cutting remarks from women who visited only to satisfy their curiosity before departing without making a single purchase. But slowly, steadily, word began to spread beyond the immediate circle who had witnessed her humiliation. Travelers passing through town discovered the shop and carried word of its fragrances to neighboring counties. A well-regarded society hostess, unaware of Alina's history, praised the shop's rose and honeysuckle blend so enthusiastically at a gathering in a distant city that orders began arriving by post from families Alina had never met. Charlotte, who had believed in Alina's talent from the very beginning, became her closest partner in the venture, helping manage correspondence and orders while Alina focused on perfecting each new blend. Together, the two young women built something neither could have imagined a year earlier, a business run entirely by women, succeeding not through connections or inherited wealth, but through genuine skill and careful, patient work. Alina also discovered, in the process, a talent she had not expected to find within herself. She proved remarkably capable with numbers, tracking expenses and profits with a precision that surprised even her father, who had always assumed such matters lay beyond a woman's natural interest or ability. She negotiated carefully with suppliers, balanced the shop's accounts meticulously, and reinvested profits thoughtfully into expanding her small collection of fragrances. Within a year, Whitmore Blooms had grown from a single modest storefront into a business known throughout the region, its fragrances requested by name in cities Alina had never visited. The transformation was not only external. Alina herself had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The young woman who had walked away from that cathedral with her composure barely intact had become someone steadier, someone who trusted her own judgment rather than waiting for approval from others. She no longer flinched at whispered mentions of her broken wedding, because she had built something the whispers could not touch, something entirely her own that no man's cruelty could take from her with a single sentence. She still thought of Alexander occasionally, though far less often than she once had. When his name did surface in her thoughts, it arrived without the sharp pain it once carried, replaced instead by a distant, almost curious sort of wonder at how thoroughly her life had changed course since the day he refused her. She heard, through occasional gossip that reached even her quiet corner of the county, that the Ashworth family's fortunes had continued to decline, that the golden romance between Alexander and Lady Cassandra Blackwood had apparently cooled, that the Duke himself had become something of a recluse, rarely seen at the social gatherings he had once attended so regularly. Elinor felt no particular satisfaction in these reports, nor did she feel lingering bitterness. She had, to her own genuine surprise, mostly stopped thinking of Alexander Ashworth at all, her days too full of orders to fill, fragrances to test, and a business to grow, for much room to remain for a man who had once tried to define her entire future with a single cruel sentence. On a bright morning nearly 18 months after the wedding that never happened, Elinor stood in the doorway of Whitmore Blooms, watching a line of customers wait patiently outside for the shop to open. Charlotte stood beside her, grinning with unrestrained pride. "Do you remember," Charlotte said quietly, "when everyone believed your life was over the moment he refused you?" Elinor smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that had become far more common in recent months. "I remember," she said. "I am grateful, in a strange way, that they were wrong." She unlocked the shop door and welcomed the first customers inside, and for a long moment, standing amid the familiar scent of roses and lavender that had become the foundation of her entire new life, Elinor Whitmore allowed herself to feel something she had not expected to feel again after that terrible day in the cathedral. She allowed herself to feel proud, not of surviving the humiliation, but of everything she had built in its place, entirely on her own terms, entirely by her own hand. What she did not yet know, standing in the warm morning light of her own thriving shop, was that fate had not finished writing her story. Somewhere across the county, in a house grown cold and quiet with mounting debt, Alexander Ashworth was about to receive news that would force his path to cross with hers once again, in circumstances neither of them could have predicted on the day their wedding collapsed in front of 300 witnesses. Not every visitor to Whitmore Blooms arrived with kindness. In the shop's early months, before its reputation had spread beyond the immediate county, Lady Beatrice Hartley herself had swept through the door one afternoon, her sharp eyes scanning the modest shelves with barely concealed amusement. "How resourceful of you, Miss Whitmore," Beatrice said, lifting a small vial and turning it over in her gloved fingers as though inspecting something faintly distasteful. "I suppose when a woman cannot secure a husband, she must find some other occupation to fill her days." Elinor had felt the old sting of humiliation rise in her chest, the familiar heat of shame she had once believed would follow her forever. But she found, to her own quiet surprise, that the feeling passed quickly, replaced by something steadier. "I suppose she must," Elinor agreed pleasantly, refusing to let her voice waver. "Fortunately, I have found the occupation rather more satisfying than a husband who did not want me in the first place." Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly unaccustomed to a target who did not wilt beneath her remarks. She set the vial down without purchasing it and left the shop moments later, but Elinor noticed, with some satisfaction, that within a month Beatrice's own maid had quietly returned to purchase 3 bottles of the rose and honeysuckle blend, insisting the transaction remain discreet. Such small victories accumulated slowly, each one reinforcing the foundation Elinor was building beneath her new life. She began keeping a private ledger, separate from the shop's official accounts, where she recorded not profits or expenses but small moments of quiet triumph, reminders on difficult days of how far she had traveled from the woman who had once stood frozen at the altar. She rarely needed to consult it. Simply knowing it existed was often enough. As the shop's reputation grew, so too did Aline's circle of acquaintances, though it looked nothing like the circle she had once expected to inhabit as a duchess. Merchants, craftswomen, and independent tradespeople began seeking her out, curious about a woman who had built a thriving business from nothing but a talent for flowers and a refusal to be defined by scandal. Among them was Captain Henry Sinclair, a former naval officer who had recently taken over his family's shipping concern and found himself, quite by accident, in need of fragrant oils to mask the less pleasant odors that lingered in his cargo holds after long voyages. Henry visited the shop initially on practical business, but he found himself returning more often than the shipping matters strictly required. He admired Aline's sharp mind, her dry sense of humor that emerged only once she felt comfortable with a person, and the quiet confidence she carried, so different from the fragile composure she had shown at her failed wedding. A story Henry had heard but never mentioned, sensing correctly that she had no wish to discuss it. "You have built something remarkable here," Henry told her one afternoon, watching as she carefully sealed a row of finished bottles. "Most people in your position would have retreated entirely from public life." "I considered it," Aline admitted, "but I decided I preferred to be known for something I built myself, rather than for something a man decided to take from me." Henry smiled at that, a genuine, appreciative smile. "A wise decision. Though I imagine it required considerable courage." "Less courage than desperation, if I am honest," Aline said, though she returned his smile. "I did not know what else to do with myself. Building something seemed better than sitting quietly and waiting for the gossip to fade." Their conversations continued over the following months, comfortable and easy in a way Aline's brief, formal courtship with Alexander had never been. Henry asked about her fragrances with genuine curiosity, listened carefully to her explanations of different extraction methods, and never once made her feel as though her ambitions were unusual or improper for a woman of her standing. Charlotte, observing the growing friendship with obvious delight, teased Aline gently about the captain's frequent visits. "He does not need nearly this much of our lavender oil for his ships," Charlotte said one afternoon, watching Henry's carriage pull away from the shop. "I suspect his true interest lies elsewhere." "Do not be ridiculous," Aline said, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite her protest. Whether or not Henry's growing attention would develop into something more remained, for the time being, an open question, one Aline did not feel any particular urgency to answer. She had spent the better part of 2 years building a life entirely on her own terms, and she found she was in no hurry to surrender any part of that independence, even to a man as genuinely kind as Henry Sinclair appeared to be. She enjoyed his company, valued his respect for her work, and allowed herself, cautiously, to consider that perhaps not every man would treat her ambitions as something to be tolerated rather than admired. By the shop's second anniversary, Whitmore Blooms had become one of the most respected fragrance houses in the region, its bottles displayed in the finest homes across the county and several neighboring ones besides. Aline had hired 2 additional assistants to help manage the growing demand, expanded her greenhouse to accommodate new varieties of flowers, and begun experimenting with fragrances suited specifically for gentlemen, a venture that Henry had encouraged enthusiastically, and that quickly proved just as successful as her original blends. She had, in every meaningful sense, become exactly what she had promised herself she would become on that terrible night after the wedding collapsed, sitting alone in her room with a list of her own skills spread across her desk. She had become someone whose worth did not depend on any man's approval, someone who commanded genuine respect throughout the county, not despite the scandal that had once threatened to define her, but because of how thoroughly she had refused to let it. The letter arrived on a gray autumn morning, delivered by a messenger in fine livery, bearing a seal Aline recognized immediately despite the years that had passed since she last saw it. Her hands went still as she turned the envelope over, the Ashworth crest pressed into dark green wax, the same crest that had once been meant to become her own family's emblem. She almost did not open it. She sat at her desk in the small office behind Whitmore Bloom's for nearly 10 minutes, the sealed letter resting untouched in front of her, while Charlotte watched with obvious curiosity from across the room. "You cannot simply stare at it forever," Charlotte finally said. "I am aware of that," Alina replied, though she made no move to break the seal. When she finally did open it, the contents surprised her. The letter was not from Alexander, but from his father, Edward Ashworth, and it was written in the careful, formal language of a man swallowing a considerable amount of pride to ask for something he badly needed. The letter explained, in measured and somewhat desperate terms, that the county's annual charity gala, an event that had for generations been hosted jointly by the region's most prominent families, faced cancellation this year due to insufficient funding. The Ashworth family, once among the gala's primary sponsors, could no longer contribute as they once had. Several other families had already withdrawn their support, unwilling to associate publicly with the diminished Ashworth name. Edward, in a final attempt to salvage both the tradition and what remained of his family's reputation, had turned to the region's most successful new business, hoping that Whitmore Bloom's might agree to sponsor a portion of the event in exchange for prominent recognition among the county's most influential attendees. Alina read the letter twice before setting it down on her desk, a complicated mixture of emotions moving through her chest. Some part of her, the part still tender from old wounds, wanted immediately to refuse, to send the letter back unanswered, and let the Ashworth family face the consequences of choices that had nothing to do with her. But another part of her, the part that had spent 2 years building a business through careful strategy rather than emotional reaction, recognized an opportunity when she saw one. "What does it say?" Charlotte asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Alina explained the contents, watching her friend's expression shift from surprise to calculation, mirroring her own thoughts almost exactly. Sponsoring the gala would put Whitmore Bloom's in front of every prominent family in 3 counties, Charlotte said slowly. "Families who might otherwise never think to visit our shop directly." "I am aware," Alina said. "And it would mean working alongside the Ashworth family." "Alongside him." Alina was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter, at the familiar seal that had once represented everything she believed her future would hold. "Yes," she said finally, "it would mean that as well." She spent 2 days considering the decision before finally sitting down to compose her response. She wrote to Edward Ashworth directly, agreeing to sponsor the gala on behalf of Whitmore Bloom's, but structuring the arrangement carefully, insisting on equal recognition alongside any remaining Ashworth contribution and full authority over the fragrances and decorative elements that would bear her business's name. She would not simply lend her success to salvage a family's reputation, while remaining quietly in the background. If she was going to walk back into that world, even briefly, she intended to do so on her own terms, fully visible, fully credited. Edward accepted her conditions without hesitation, a fact that told Alina a great deal about how desperate the family's circumstances had truly become. The preparations for the gala required several meetings over the following weeks, meetings that necessarily involved coordination with the Ashworth household regarding decoration, timing, and the overall arrangement of the event. Alina had assumed, reasonably, that these meetings would involve Edward Ashworth himself, or perhaps a household representative. She had not expected, walking into the drawing room of Ashworth Hall for the first planning session, to find Alexander seated at the table instead of his father. He rose immediately when she entered, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. 2 years had changed them both. Alexander looked thinner than she remembered, the careless confidence that had once defined him replaced by something quieter, more guarded. The fine clothing he wore, while still respectable, no longer carried the same effortless polish it once had, a small but telling sign of a household managing its remaining resources with considerably more care than in years past. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, his voice careful, uncertain in a way she had never heard from him before. "I did not realize you would be the one attending in person." Your father invited Whitmore Blooms as a sponsor, Elinor said, her own voice steady and composed, giving nothing away of the storm of emotions moving beneath the surface. I am the owner. It seemed appropriate that I attend the planning sessions myself. Of course, Alexander said. Forgive me, I simply assumed. I did not expect this particular arrangement. Neither did I, Elinor said, taking a seat across the table from him without waiting to be invited, when I received your father's letter. But circumstances change, it seems, for us both. The comment landed with quiet precision, and Elinor watched something flicker across Alexander's face, an acknowledgement of exactly what she meant without either of them needing to speak the memory aloud. 2 years had passed since he had left her standing at that altar, and here they sat, forced together again by the very fortune he had once tried to secure through her family's money and now needed, in an entirely different form, through her own hard-earned success. Their meeting proceeded with careful, business-like formality. Elinor outlined her proposed contributions, the fragrances she intended to provide for the event, the floral arrangements her greenhouse could supply, the specific terms of recognition she expected in exchange for her sponsorship. Alexander listened attentively, occasionally offering suggestions about the venue or guest list, but mostly deferring to her expertise, a deference that surprised her given how little regard he had once shown for her opinions during their brief courtship. You have built something impressive, he said finally, near the end of their meeting, when the practical matters had largely been settled. I confess I did not expect this when I heard rumors of your business venture. Most people did not expect it, Elinor said simply. I did not entirely expect it myself when I began. I am glad, Alexander said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it more sincerely than the polite comment required. You deserved better than what I gave you that day. I have thought about it often, more than you likely believe possible. Elinor studied him carefully, searching his face for the same coldness she remembered from the altar, the same detached cruelty that had once dismissed her in front of hundreds of witnesses. She found instead something that looked almost like genuine regret, though she reminded herself immediately not to trust her own reading of his expression too quickly. She had trusted this man once before, and that trust had cost her more than she cared to remember in detail. I did not come here for apologies, Your Grace, she said, deliberately using his formal title, a small reminder of the distance that remained between them despite the circumstances forcing them together. I came here because your father's letter presented an opportunity for my business, nothing more. Of course, Alexander said quickly, straightening in his chair, the momentary vulnerability in his expression retreating behind more familiar formality. Business, naturally. Elinor gathered her papers and rose from the table, preparing to depart. At the door she paused, glancing back at him one final time. The gala is in 3 weeks, she said. I will send my staff to begin the floral arrangements the week prior. I trust that arrangement is acceptable. Entirely acceptable, Alexander said. She left Ashworth Hall that afternoon with her composure fully intact, climbing into her carriage and instructing the driver toward Whitmore Blooms without a single backward glance at the grand house she had once believed she would call home. But as the carriage pulled away, she found her thoughts circling back, against her own wishes, to the expression on Alexander's face when he had spoken of his regret. She had spent 2 years building a life that no longer required his approval, no longer depended on his opinion of her in any way. She told herself firmly that nothing about this unexpected meeting had changed that fact. She was not entirely certain, by the time her carriage reached the familiar streets near her shop, that she believed herself. That evening, Elinor found herself unable to focus on the shop's accounts, her mind returning again and again to the strange, unsettling meeting at Ashworth Hall. Charlotte noticed her distraction almost immediately when she arrived to help close the shop for the night. You have added the same column of figures 3 times, Charlotte observed, glancing over Elinor's shoulder at the ledger, and gotten a different sum each time. Elinor set down her pen with a sigh. It was strange, Charlotte, seeing him again after everything. Strange how? Was he cruel to you again? No, Elinor admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. He was almost gracious, quiet he seemed, different than I remembered. Charlotte studied her friend carefully, recognizing something in Aliner's expression that gave her pause. Aliner, whatever he seemed like today, do not forget what he actually did. 2 years is not so very long. A man does not become a different person simply because his fortune has changed. I have not forgotten, Aliner said firmly. I am not foolish enough to mistake circumstance for genuine change, Charlotte. I know precisely why the Ashworth family requires my help now, and it has very little to do with any transformation of character. Good, Charlotte said, though her expression remained watchful. Because I would rather see you married to your business for the rest of your days than see that man break your heart a second time. Aliner laughed, though the sound carried less certainty than she intended. There is no danger of that. I attended a business meeting, Charlotte, nothing more. I have no intention of allowing old feelings to interfere with a sound financial arrangement. Privately, however, Aliner found herself replaying certain moments of the conversation more than she cared to admit, particularly the brief flash of vulnerability that had crossed Alexander's face when he spoke of his regret. She reminded herself sternly, walking home beneath the darkening autumn sky, that regret spoken aloud cost a man nothing, while the humiliation she had endured at the altar had cost her nearly everything, at least for a time. She would not allow a few carefully chosen words to undo 2 years of hard-won independence. Over the following days, preparation for the gala consumed most of Aliner's attention, leaving little room for dwelling further on Alexander Ashworth or the complicated feelings his presence had stirred. Her staff began preparing the elaborate floral arrangements that would decorate Ashworth Hall for the event, while Aliner personally oversaw the creation of a special commemorative fragrance meant to be gifted to attending guests. A delicate blend of jasmine and citrus she named, after some consideration, simply Renewal. The choice of name was not lost on Charlotte, who raised an eyebrow when she saw it written on the order forms. An interesting choice, Charlotte said. It suits the gala's purpose, Aliner replied evenly. A charity event meant to renew the county's support for those in need. Nothing more significant than that. Charlotte said nothing further, though the look on her face suggested she suspected the name carried more personal meaning than Aliner was willing to acknowledge aloud, even to herself. Meanwhile, at Ashworth Hall, Alexander found himself similarly preoccupied, though he was considerably less successful than Aliner at convincing himself the preoccupation meant nothing. He caught himself, more than once in the days following their meeting, remembering small details of her manner that he had somehow failed to notice during their brief courtship years earlier. The precise way she organized her arguments before speaking, the dry humor that occasionally slipped through her formal composure, the quiet confidence with which she now carried herself, so entirely different from the nervous, eager bride he remembered standing beside him at that altar. You seem distracted, Lucas observed one evening, finding Alexander staring into the fireplace rather than attending to the correspondence spread across his desk. I am considering the gala arrangements, Alexander said, though the excuse felt thin even as he spoke it. You are considering Miss Whitmore, Lucas said, not unkindly, but with the directness of a man who had served Alexander long enough to see past his employer's careful deflections. I noticed it the moment you returned from Ashworth Hall's planning session, sir. You have barely stopped thinking of her since. Alexander did not deny it, though he offered no confirmation either, simply staring into the flames with an expression Lucas had not seen on his face in the 2 difficult years since the wedding collapsed. Whatever certainty Alexander had once possessed about his own heart, about Cassandra, about the choices that had led his family to its current difficult circumstances, seemed to be quietly, steadily unraveling in the wake of a single unexpected meeting with the woman he had once so carelessly discarded. The night of the charity gala arrived cold and clear, the sky above Ashworth Hall scattered with stars as carriages lined the long gravel drive, delivering guests from every corner of the county and beyond. Inside, the grand ballroom had been transformed entirely, its walls lined with cascading arrangements of white roses and trailing jasmine, the air filled with the delicate, unmistakable fragrance of Aliner's newest creation. Aliner arrived early, overseeing the final placement of her arrangements alongside her staff, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk that suited her far better than the pale silver she had worn 2 years earlier. She moved through the ballroom with quiet authority, adjusting a centerpiece here, correcting the placement of a floral arch there, entirely in command of her domain despite standing in the very house where her public humiliation had originated. Guests began arriving shortly after, and Aliner watched with a strange, distant satisfaction as familiar faces from the county's most prominent families paused near her floral displays, remarking admiringly on the fragrances filling the room, many of them unaware they were praising the work of the same woman they had once whispered about so cruelly. "You have outdone yourself," Charlotte murmured, appearing at Aliner's side with 2 glasses of champagne. "Half the room is asking who arranged the flowers. I have told at least a dozen people already." "Let them ask," Aliner said, accepting the glass with a small smile. "I have nothing left to hide from this crowd." Across the ballroom, Alexander watched Aliner move through the gathering with a composure and confidence that struck him more forcefully than he had expected. Gone entirely was the anxious, deferential young woman he remembered from their brief courtship. In her place stood someone who commanded the attention of the room not through title or inheritance, but through genuine accomplishment, and Alexander found himself unable to look away for more than a few minutes at a time throughout the long evening. His attention did not go unnoticed. Lady Cassandra Blackwood, who had accepted an invitation to the gala despite the considerable coolness that had developed between herself and Alexander over the preceding months, observed his focus on Aliner with an expression of sharp, calculating displeasure. "You are staring," Cassandra said, appearing beside him with a glass of wine she had barely touched. "It is unbecoming, Alexander, particularly given the history between you and Miss Whitmore." "I am simply observing the arrangements," Alexander said, though the lie sounded weak even to his own ears. "The arrangements," Cassandra repeated, her tone dry with disbelief. "You have not glanced at a single flower all evening. You have, however, watched that woman's every movement since she arrived." Alexander said nothing, unwilling to confirm what they both already understood. His relationship with Cassandra had cooled considerably in the 2 years since the wedding, the passionate intensity that had once defined their secret courtship replaced gradually by something colder, more transactional. He had begun to understand, slowly and painfully, that Cassandra's affection had always been tied closely to his title and prospects that had diminished sharply since the collapse of the Whitmore marriage and the financial consequences that followed. Her continued presence in his life over the past 2 years had felt less like devotion and more like a woman keeping her options carefully open while she assessed whether a better prospect might yet appear. That better prospect, it seemed, had recently arrived in the form of Lord Frederick Ainsley, a wealthy widower with considerably more secure finances than Alexander now possessed, who had begun courting Cassandra with an enthusiasm she made little effort to discourage. "I have heard Lord Ainsley has been most attentive lately," Alexander said, deliberately changing the subject away from his own behavior. "I understand he has offered you a considerable settlement." Cassandra's expression flickered, a brief crack in her composed exterior. "That is none of your concern, Alexander." "Is it not?" Alexander asked, his voice quieter now, more direct than he had allowed himself to be with her in months. "I gave up everything for you once, Cassandra, my family's fortune, my reputation. A woman who, from everything I have witnessed tonight, deserved considerably better treatment than either of us gave her. I believe I have earned the right to ask whether the sacrifice meant anything to you at all." Cassandra's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Alexander saw something genuine flash across her expression, though whether it was guilt or simple irritation at being challenged, he could not entirely determine. "You made your own choices, Alexander," she said finally. "I never asked you to ruin yourself. If your family's fortune has suffered, that is a consequence of your decisions, not mine. You encouraged those decisions, Alexander said. I remember quite clearly. I encouraged you to follow your heart, Cassandra said. I did not force your hand at any altar. Do not mistake my honesty for cruelty, Alexander, nor pretend you were an innocent party in any of this. She walked away before he could respond further, crossing the ballroom to accept Lord Ainsley's offered arm with a warmth she had not shown Alexander in many months. He watched her go, and to his own considerable surprise, felt very little beyond a distant, almost relieved sense of closure. Whatever had existed between them, whatever passionate certainty had once convinced him to destroy another woman's wedding day for its sake, had clearly run its course, leaving behind only the wreckage he had created in pursuing it. He found himself, not long after, standing near the edge of the ballroom where Elinor was overseeing a final adjustment to one of her floral arrangements, her staff having largely completed their work for the evening. The gala appears to be a considerable success, Alexander said, approaching carefully, uncertain of his welcome. Elinor glanced up, her expression composed but not unfriendly. Your father seems pleased. I understand donations tonight have already exceeded last year's total, despite the difficulties facing your family's usual contribution. Thanks entirely to your involvement, Alexander said. I do not believe the event would have proceeded at all without your sponsorship. Perhaps not, Elinor agreed without false modesty. Though I suspect your father would have found another solution eventually. Desperation tends to produce creativity. Alexander smiled faintly at that, recognizing the small, dry humor he remembered from certain of her old letters, humor he had barely noticed at the time, too distracted by his own preoccupations to appreciate the sharp intelligence behind it. You have changed a great deal in 2 years, he said quietly. I had considerable motivation to change, Elinor replied, her tone carrying no particular bitterness, simply plain observation. I know, Alexander said. I am aware that I provided that motivation in the cruelest possible manner. Elinor studied him carefully for a long moment, the noise of the gala continuing around them, laughter and music, and the soft clink of glasses filling the grand ballroom while the two of them stood in a small pocket of quiet near the edge of the room. Why are you telling me this now, Your Grace? She asked finally. What purpose does this confession serve 2 years after the fact? Alexander hesitated, searching for an honest answer rather than a convenient one. I am not entirely certain, he admitted. I only know that watching you tonight, watching everything you have built despite what I did to you, I find myself questioning choices I spent a very long time convincing myself were justified. That is a difficult thing to hear, Elinor said quietly, from a man who once could not bring himself to speak a single kind word to me, even in private, before humiliating me in front of the entire county. I know, Alexander said. I have no excuse that would satisfy either of us. I only wished you to know that the regret is genuine, whatever else you choose to believe about me. Elinor considered his words carefully, weighing them against 2 years of hard-won independence, against the memory of standing frozen at that altar while he dismantled her future in front of hundreds of witnesses. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she believed him, at least in this moment, though belief and forgiveness remained, in her mind, 2 entirely separate matters. I appreciate your honesty, she said finally. But regret does not undo what happened, Your Grace, nor does it obligate me to offer anything in return beyond acknowledgement that I have heard it. I understand, Alexander said. I ask for nothing beyond that. They stood together in silence for a moment longer, the distance between them neither fully closed nor entirely as wide as it had been only weeks earlier. Then Elinor excused herself politely, returning to oversee the final hours of the gala, leaving Alexander standing alone near the fragrant floral arrangements that bore silent testament to everything she had built from the wreckage he had created. He did not follow her. He understood, watching her move confidently through the crowded ballroom, greeting guests, and accepting compliments on her work with easy grace, that whatever ground he hoped to recover with Elinor Whitmore would not be won through a single evening's confession, however sincere. It would require considerably more than words, more than regret spoken quietly at the edge of a crowded room. It would require proving, through sustained and deliberate action, that the man standing before her tonight was genuinely different from the one who had left her at that altar 2 years earlier. And Alexander was only beginning to understand how difficult and how necessary that proof would be. Later that evening, after most guests had departed, and only the household staff remained to clear the ballroom, Edward Ashworth approached Alina as she supervised the removal of her remaining floral displays. "Miss Whitmore," Edward said, his voice carrying none of the desperate formality of his earlier letter, replaced instead by something more genuinely humble. "I do not believe I have adequately expressed my gratitude for your generosity tonight. This family owes you a debt we can scarcely begin to repay. The gala's success benefits my business as much as your family's reputation, Your Grace," Alina said, though her tone carried less coolness than it might have only weeks earlier. "I would not call it charity." "Perhaps not," Edward said, "but you had every reason to refuse my letter entirely, given the history between our families. You chose instead to help, and I do not take that choice lightly, whatever your reasons for making it." Alina paused in her work, studying the older man carefully. He looked considerably more tired than she remembered, the weight of 2 years of financial struggle etched clearly into his features. "I hold no particular animosity toward you personally, Your Grace," she said finally. "Your son's choices were his own. I do not believe you forced his hand at the altar, whatever arrangement existed between our families beforehand." "I forced the circumstances that led him there," Edward said quietly. "I have had a great deal of time to consider my own role in what happened that day. I pressed him into an arrangement he did not choose, without ever asking what he wanted, and I have watched the consequences of that decision unfold for both our families ever since. I am sorry for the part I played in your humiliation, Miss Whitmore, even if I cannot speak for my son's actions on that day." Alina had not expected such candor from Edward Ashworth, and she found herself considering his words carefully before responding. "Apology accepted, Your Grace," she said finally. "Though I confess I have built a life since that day which no longer requires it, one way or the other." "I can see that," Edward said, glancing around at the transformed ballroom, at the evidence everywhere of Alina's success. "And for what it is worth, I believe my late mother would have admired what you have built. She always said a garden revealed more about a person's character than any ballroom ever could." The comment struck Alina unexpectedly, reminding her of her own grandmother's similar wisdom, the quiet lessons about patience and cultivation that had first led her toward the greenhouse in the darkest days following her humiliation. She thanked Edward for his kind words and returned to her work, but the exchange lingered in her thoughts long after she had returned home that night, sitting in her small office reviewing the evening's considerable success. Charlotte found her there past midnight, the ledgers spread across her desk though Alina had made little progress in actually reviewing them, her attention clearly elsewhere. "You are thinking about him again," Charlotte said, settling into the chair across from Alina's desk without waiting for an invitation. "I am thinking about the gala's proceeds," Alina said, though the deflection was weaker than usual. "Alina," Charlotte's voice carried gentle but firm warning. "I saw you speaking with him near the edge of the ballroom. I saw your face afterward. Do not pretend to me that nothing happened in that conversation." Alina set down her pen with a sigh, finally abandoning the pretense. "He apologized, Charlotte. Genuinely, I believe, though I cannot be entirely certain. He said watching what I have built made him question every choice that led to that day." "And what did you say?" "I told him regret does not undo what happened," Alina said. "Which is true, it does not." "But," Charlotte prompted, recognizing the hesitation in her friend's voice. "But I found myself believing him, at least in that moment," Alina admitted quietly. "Which frightens me considerably more than his cruelty ever did, if I am honest. I spent 2 years building a version of myself that did not need his approval or his affection to feel whole. I am not certain I wish to risk that foundation on the possibility that he has genuinely changed." Charlotte reached across the desk and took her friend's hand, her expression softening. "Then do not risk it," she said simply. "Whatever he says, whatever regret he claims to feel, you owe him nothing, Alina. Not forgiveness, not a second chance, not even your continued attention. You built this life without him. You are entitled to keep it that way if you choose." "I know," Alina said. "I only wish the choice felt as simple as you make it sound." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the small office lit only by a single lamp, the successful evening's proceeds still uncounted on the desk between them. Alina did not have an answer, not yet, for the complicated feelings Alexander's apology had stirred within her, feelings she had believed thoroughly settled and put to rest over the past 2 years. But she recognized, sitting there in the quiet aftermath of the gala, that something had shifted that evening, some careful balance she had maintained since walking away from that altar, and she was not entirely certain, for the first time in a very long while, what direction her life might take from here. Word of Lord Ainsley's engagement to Lady Cassandra Blackwood reached Alexander barely 3 weeks after the charity gala, delivered not through any personal correspondence, but through the same efficient network of gossip that had once carried news of his own public humiliation across the county within hours. He received the news standing in the entrance hall of Ashworth Hall, reading it in a brief notice printed among the society announcements, and found himself surprised by how little the words affected him. "You do not seem troubled," Lucas observed, watching his employer fold the newspaper closed with steady hands. "I am not," Alexander said, and meant it. "I believe I have known for some time that whatever existed between Cassandra and myself had already ended, regardless of what either of us chose to call it publicly." "Then perhaps this is a fortunate turn of events," Lucas said carefully. "A clean ending rather than a slow unraveling." Alexander considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps," he agreed, "though it does raise an uncomfortable question, Lucas. If Cassandra was never truly the reason worth sacrificing everything for, what exactly did I destroy my family's fortune and another woman's reputation to obtain?" Lucas had no answer for that, and Alexander did not truly expect one. The question had been circling his thoughts with increasing frequency since the gala, growing louder each time he recalled the composed, confident version of Alina Whitmore he had encountered that evening. So entirely different from the anxious young woman he remembered standing beside him at the altar. He had spent 2 years telling himself he had acted out of love, out of a genuine desire to spare Alina a loveless marriage. He was beginning to understand, with increasing discomfort, that the story he had told himself bore little resemblance to the truth. The truth, as Alexander was slowly forced to confront it in the weeks following the gala, was considerably less flattering. He had been a young man frightened of a life chosen for him by others, and rather than facing that fear honestly, rather than having the difficult conversation with his father that circumstances required, he had taken the easiest available path toward apparent freedom, regardless of the cost to anyone standing in his way. He had convinced himself that Cassandra represented true love, when in reality she had represented only the illusion of choice, a decision that felt like rebellion, but had never actually required him to examine what he truly wanted from his own life. Edward noticed the change in his son over the following weeks, a quiet, contemplative quality that had not been present in Alexander since long before the collapsed wedding. "You have been unusually thoughtful lately," Edward remarked one evening, finding Alexander seated alone in the library, a book open in his lap that he had clearly not been reading. "I have been reconsidering a great many things, Father," Alexander said, "choices I made 2 years ago. The reasons I told myself justified them." Edward settled into the chair across from his son, recognizing something significant in Alexander's tone. "And what have you concluded?" "That I was a coward," Alexander said simply. "I dressed my cowardice up as passion, as love, as rebellion against a marriage forced upon me. But the truth is considerably simpler than that. I was afraid of a future I had not chosen for myself, and rather than facing that fear like a man, I destroyed an innocent woman's reputation to avoid confronting it." Edward was quiet for a long moment, considering his son's admission carefully. "I have wondered these past 2 years whether you would ever arrive at that understanding," he said finally. "I confess I worried you might spend the rest of your life justifying that day rather than examining it honestly." "I very nearly did," Alexander admitted. "I do not know precisely what changed. Seeing Alina again at the gala, perhaps. Seeing everything she built from the wreckage I created, while I built nothing at all beyond further ruin and a relationship that meant considerably less than I once convinced myself it did." "What do you intend to do with this understanding?" Edward asked. Alexander did not have an immediate answer. He knew only that the quiet, contemplative unease that had settled over him, since the gala would not resolve itself through further private reflection alone. He needed to act, though he was not yet certain what form that action should take, nor whether any action he took could possibly repair the damage 2 years of cruelty and cowardice had caused. He began, in the weeks that followed, by attempting to rebuild what remained of his family's finances through legitimate effort, rather than convenient marriages or inherited privilege. He sought out a distant cousin with connections in the shipping trade, securing a modest position that required him to learn the practical realities of commerce, ledgers, contracts, and negotiations, skills he had never once needed to develop during his previous life of assumed inheritance. The work was unfamiliar and often humbling, requiring him to defer to men of considerably lower social standing, whose practical knowledge far exceeded his own. But Alexander found, to his genuine surprise, a certain satisfaction in earning something through his own effort rather than simply expecting it as his birthright. "You have grown considerably more humble," Lucas observed one evening, watching Alexander review a stack of shipping contracts with careful attention, rather than the careless indifference he might once have shown such tedious work. "I have had a great deal of practice at humility these past 2 years," Alexander said dryly. "Though I confess it suits me rather better than I expected." The work brought him, unexpectedly, into closer proximity with Henry Sinclair, whose shipping concern occasionally intersected with the same trade routes and contacts Alexander's cousin utilized. Their early meetings were coolly professional, both men aware of Henry's growing friendship with Alina, though neither spoke of it directly. Over time, however, a grudging respect developed between them, born of shared practical concerns and Alexander's evident, genuine effort to master an unfamiliar trade rather than simply relying on his title to smooth every difficulty. "You have changed since the gala," Henry remarked one afternoon, the two men reviewing a shipping manifest together in Henry's modest office near the harbor. "I confess I did not expect it, given what I had heard of your history." "I imagine you have heard a great deal," Alexander said without defensiveness, "most of it likely accurate." "Most of it," Henry agreed. "Though I judge a man by his current conduct more than his past mistakes, provided the change appears genuine rather than convenient." "I understand your caution," Alexander said. "I would extend the same caution myself in your position." Henry studied him carefully for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore is a remarkable woman," he said finally, his tone carrying deliberate weight. "She rebuilt an entire life from nothing after what happened at that altar. I would not wish to see that hard-won peace disrupted by a man seeking only to ease his own guilty conscience, regardless of how genuine his current intentions might appear." "Neither would I," Alexander said quietly. "I have no wish to cause her further harm, Captain Sinclair. I am uncertain, in truth, what I hope to accomplish beyond acknowledging the wrong I did her as honestly as I am able." Henry seemed to consider this response carefully before nodding, apparently satisfied, at least for the moment, with the sincerity behind it. Their conversation returned to shipping matters, but the exchange lingered in Alexander's thoughts long after he left Henry's office that evening, a reminder that whatever path forward existed between himself and Alina, it would require considerably more patience and genuine transformation than a single sincere apology at a crowded gala could provide. He began, in small and careful ways, to demonstrate that transformation. He declined several invitations to social events where his presence might have drawn unwanted attention, or gossip toward Aliner's continued involvement with his family's affairs. He worked diligently at his new position, earning modest but genuine income that he directed entirely toward settling his family's outstanding debts rather than maintaining appearances. He wrote, though he did not send, several letters to Aliner over the following months, attempting to articulate an apology more complete and more honest than the brief words he had offered at the gala, though each attempt felt inadequate compared to the magnitude of what he owed her. It was Edward, surprisingly, who finally convinced him that words alone, however carefully composed, would never be sufficient. "You cannot write your way out of what happened at that altar," Edward told him one evening, finding the latest unsent letter abandoned on Alexander's desk. "Nor can you simply wait, quietly reforming yourself in private, and hope she eventually notices the change from a distance. If you truly wish to make amends, Alexander, you must be willing to demonstrate it plainly, publicly, in whatever manner she requires, without any guarantee that your effort will be rewarded with her forgiveness." "And if she refuses to hear me at all?" Alexander asked. "Then you accept that outcome with grace," Edward said simply, "and continue building an honest life regardless, because the change you have undergone these past months should exist for its own sake, not merely as a means of winning back a woman's affection. But I do not believe, having watched you these past several months, that your transformation is quite so shallow as that." Alexander considered his father's words carefully, understanding the truth within them even as they unsettled him. He had spent months quietly reforming himself, working diligently, reflecting honestly on the failures that had led him to that terrible day at the altar. But quiet reform, however genuine, would mean little to Aliner Whitmore unless he found the courage to demonstrate it directly, without the safety of a business arrangement or the formal distance of a charity gala to shield him from the full weight of what he needed to say. He did not yet know how he would find that courage, nor whether Aliner would grant him any opportunity to demonstrate it. But he understood, sitting alone in his study with a stack of unsent letters scattered across his desk, that the time for quiet, private reflection had passed. If he truly wished to become the man he was slowly, painfully learning to be, he would need to prove it where it mattered most, directly to the woman he had wronged, regardless of the outcome that proof might bring. News of Alexander's changed circumstances reached Aliner gradually, in fragments carried by customers and acquaintances, rather than any direct communication between them. She heard, through Charlotte, that the Duke had taken a position within a shipping concern, an arrangement unheard of for a man of his rank, and that he attended his duties with a diligence that surprised those who remembered his earlier reputation for careless entitlement. She heard, through Henry, that Alexander had grown notably quieter, more thoughtful, less inclined toward the social gatherings he had once attended so readily. "He asked after you," Henry mentioned one afternoon, delivering a fresh order of oil casings to the shop and lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Only briefly. He seemed reluctant to press the matter." "What did you tell him?" Aliner asked, keeping her attention carefully fixed on the ledger in front of her. "That you were well," Henry said, "and considerably too occupied with your own success to spare much thought for a man who once treated you so poorly." Aliner allowed herself a small smile at that. "An accurate summary, though perhaps a touch generous regarding how little thought I have spared him." Henry studied her carefully, his expression thoughtful. "You have thought of him, then?" "Occasionally," Aliner admitted, setting down her pen. "It is difficult not to, when half the county insists on informing me of his every reported improvement. I confess I do not entirely know what to make of it." "Perhaps it means nothing beyond a man attempting to repair what he can of his own conscience," Henry said carefully. "Or perhaps it means something more. I do not believe it is my place to tell you which, Aliner. Only you can determine what weight, if any, his transformation deserves in your own life." Aliner appreciated Henry's careful restraint, his evident refusal to press his own growing affection for her into a decision that belonged entirely to her. She had come to value his steady, undemanding presence considerably over the preceding months, though she had not yet allowed herself to examine too closely what exactly that growing fondness might mean for either of them. The clearest evidence of Alexander's changed character arrived not through gossip, but through direct action, several months after the gala, when a sudden fire damaged a portion of Whitmore Bloom's storage building, destroying a significant quantity of rare oils and materials Alina had spent considerable resources acquiring. The loss threatened to set her business back substantially, and she spent several difficult days calculating whether the shop could absorb the damage without requiring a costly loan she had hoped never to need. An anonymous benefactor's contribution arrived within the week, delivered through her banker with no name attached beyond instructions that the funds be applied directly toward replacing the damaged materials. Alina suspected immediately who had arranged it, though she could not prove the connection, and when she pressed her banker for details, he revealed only that the funds had originated from an account associated with recent shipping profits, information that pointed unmistakably toward Alexander's new employment. She confronted him directly the following week, arriving unannounced at the small shipping office where he now worked, her expression carefully composed despite the considerable emotion churning beneath the surface. "I understand you have taken an interest in my business troubles," she said, without preamble, the moment she found him alone in his cramped office. Alexander looked up from his ledgers, clearly startled by her sudden appearance but recovering his composure quickly. "I do not know what you mean, Miss Whitmore." "Do not insult me by pretending otherwise," Alina said, though her tone carried more weariness than genuine anger. "I know precisely where anonymous contributions to my business originate, Your Grace, however carefully you attempt to obscure the source." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, weighing whether further denial would serve any purpose. "I heard of the fire," he said finally. "I could not, in good conscience, allow you to face that loss alone when I possess the means to help, however modest those means currently remain." "I did not ask for your help," Alina said. "I have managed considerably worse difficulties without your assistance these past 2 years." "I am aware," Alexander said. "I did not offer the contribution because I believed you incapable of managing without it. I offered it because I wished, in whatever small way remained available to me, to begin repaying a debt I owe you that no amount of money could ever truly settle." Alina studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the careless cruelty she remembered from the altar, finding instead only quiet, genuine sincerity in his expression. "I do not know what to do with this version of you, Alexander," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. "The man who left me at that altar I understood entirely. This man, I confess, I do not yet know how to judge." "I do not ask you to judge me favorably," Alexander said. "I only ask that you allow me the opportunity to continue proving, through whatever means remain available to me, that the change is genuine, regardless of whether it ever earns your forgiveness." Alina left his office that afternoon without a clear answer, though something had shifted subtly in the careful distance she had maintained since the gala, a distance that felt, for the first time in many months, slightly less certain than it once had. Alina did not see Alexander again for nearly a month after their conversation in his cramped shipping office, though she found her thoughts returning to him with a frequency that unsettled her carefully maintained composure. She threw herself into the shop's continued growth, expanding Whitmore Bloom's into a second location in a neighboring town, training 2 new apprentices in the careful art of fragrance blending, and allowing the practical demands of a thriving business to occupy the space in her mind that Alexander's unexpected transformation had begun to fill. Henry noticed her distraction, though he said little about it directly, continuing his own steady, patient courtship without pressing her for answers she was clearly not yet prepared to give. His restraint, Alina reflected more than once, stood in stark contrast to the careless disregard Alexander had once shown her feelings, and she found herself genuinely grateful for his patience even as she recognized, with some discomfort, that her heart had not settled as clearly in his direction as either of them might have hoped. The resolution, when it finally arrived, came not through any grand gesture, but through a quiet Sunday afternoon when Alexander appeared at the shop unannounced, standing awkwardly near the entrance while Alina finished serving a customer. "I did not expect to see you here," Alina said, once the shop had emptied and they stood facing each other amid the familiar scent of roses and lavender. "I did not intend to come," Alexander admitted. "I have walked past this street perhaps a dozen times these past weeks, always finding some reason to turn back before reaching your door. Today I decided I had run out of reasonable excuses." "And what did you hope to accomplish by finally arriving?" Alina asked, though her tone carried curiosity rather than hostility. Alexander took a steadying breath. "I wish to ask you something directly, rather than continuing to circle the question through anonymous gestures and careful distance. I have spent the past several months attempting to prove, through action rather than words, that I have genuinely changed since that terrible day at the altar. I do not know whether I have succeeded in convincing you of that change, but I find I can no longer bear the uncertainty of not asking plainly what you believe." "What are you asking exactly?" Alina said, though she suspected she already understood. "Whether you believe there remains any possibility for us," Alexander said. "Not immediately, not without considerable further proof on my part, but eventually. I understand if the answer is no. I understand, better than most, precisely how much damage I caused and how little right I have to expect forgiveness, let alone anything beyond it. But I needed to ask directly, rather than continuing to wonder in silence." Alina was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. She thought of the terrified young bride who had once stood frozen at that altar, humiliated in front of hundreds of witnesses. She thought of the 2 years of difficult, deliberate work that had transformed her into a woman who no longer needed any man's approval to feel whole. She thought of Henry's patient kindness, of the comfortable, undemanding affection that had grown steadily between them. And she thought, finally, of the quiet sincerity in Alexander's expression these past months, the genuine effort he had shown in rebuilding not just his family's fortune, but his own character, without any guarantee that the effort would ever be rewarded. "I will not pretend the past does not matter, Alexander," she said finally. "What you did to me at that altar was cruel, regardless of your reasons, and I will not simply set that memory aside because you have spent several months demonstrating genuine effort at change. Forgiveness, if it comes at all, must be earned slowly and completely, not granted because I find myself moved by a single sincere conversation in my own shop." "I understand," Alexander said quietly. "I do not ask for immediate forgiveness. I only ask for the opportunity to continue earning it." "There is more," Alina said. "If I am ever to consider any future between us, it will not be as a quiet, private understanding built on guilt and gradual reconciliation alone. If you are genuinely changed, Alexander, you must be willing to acknowledge what happened at that altar publicly, as openly as you once humiliated me, rather than allowing our history to remain a quiet secret settled privately between the two of us while the rest of the county continues to whisper their own version of events." Alexander considered this carefully, understanding the weight of what she was asking. A public acknowledgement would mean reopening the very scandal his family had worked so hard to move beyond, risking whatever fragile reputation he had begun rebuilding through months of quiet, diligent effort. It would mean standing before the same society that had once mocked and pitied Alina, admitting plainly and completely the full extent of his cruelty, without the protection of vague apologies or private confessions that could later be minimized or forgotten. "I understand what you are asking," he said finally, "and I accept the condition, difficult as it will undoubtedly prove. If genuine change requires public accountability, then I will provide it, regardless of the cost to whatever reputation I have managed to rebuild." "I am not asking you to grovel, Alexander," Alina said, her tone softening slightly. "I am asking you to be honest in the same public manner you once chose to be cruel. If you can manage that honestly, without expectation of immediate reward, then perhaps, in time, there might be room to consider what comes next between us. But I will not rush toward that possibility, nor will I abandon the life I have built to accommodate a courtship on your timeline rather than my own. I would not ask you to, Alexander said. I have learned, however painfully, that rushing toward convenient answers rather than facing difficult truths honestly is precisely the failure that led me to that altar in the first place. I have no wish to repeat that particular mistake. Alina studied him for a long moment, searching once more for any trace of insincerity, finding instead only steady, patient resolve. Then we understand each other, she said finally. I make no promises beyond this conversation, Alexander, but I am willing to observe, going forward, whether your actions continue to match your words. He left the shop that afternoon without any guarantee beyond her willingness to observe, but the conversation settled something in him that months of quiet private reflection had failed to accomplish. He understood now, with complete clarity, precisely what path lay before him if he genuinely wished to earn back any measure of the respect and trust he had so carelessly destroyed 2 years earlier. It would require more than anonymous contributions and private apologies. It would require standing before the entire county, exactly as he had stood at that altar, and choosing this time to speak the truth rather than the convenient cruelty that had once come so easily to him. Alina, for her part, spent the following days considering the conversation carefully, aware that she had opened a door she had believed permanently closed, though she had opened it only partway, with conditions attached that she suspected Alexander might struggle to fulfill. She mentioned the exchange to Charlotte that evening, expecting her friend's usual cautious skepticism. You asked him to publicly acknowledge what happened, Charlotte said, considering this carefully. That is no small request, Alina. It could cost him whatever remains of his family's reputation. I am aware, Alina said. I did not make the request lightly. If he is genuinely changed, he will find a way to honor it. If he is not, I will have my answer clearly enough, without wasting further months wondering which version of him is real. Charlotte nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her friend's careful strategy. And Henry, she asked gently, what becomes of him while you wait to see which version of Alexander proves true? Alina's expression grew more complicated at the question. I do not know, she admitted honestly. I care for Henry a great deal, Charlotte. He has been patient and kind in ways Alexander never once managed during our original courtship. I do not wish to cause him pain by keeping this uncertainty alive longer than necessary. Then perhaps you should speak with him honestly, Charlotte suggested, rather than allowing him to wait indefinitely while you determine which man deserves your heart. Alina knew her friend was right, and the following week, she found the courage to speak plainly with Henry about the complicated situation, explaining honestly the conversation she had shared with Alexander and the uncertain path it had opened before her. Henry listened with characteristic patience, though she could see the disappointment he carefully worked to conceal. I appreciate your honesty, he said finally. I will not pretend the news brings me pleasure, Alina. I had hoped in time that you might come to feel for me what I have grown to feel for you. But I would rather know the truth of your heart now than continue pursuing a courtship you cannot fully commit to. I am sorry, Henry, Alina said, genuine regret coloring her voice. You deserve considerably better than the uncertainty I have offered you these past months. Do not apologize for an honest heart, Henry said, managing a small, genuine smile despite his evident disappointment. Whatever you decide, Alina, I hope you find the happiness you deserve, whichever path leads you there. I only ask that you choose carefully, and that you never again settle for less than the respect you have earned through everything you have built. They parted that afternoon on terms of genuine, if bittersweet, friendship, and Alina returned home with a clearer understanding of her own heart than she had possessed in many months, even as the larger question of Alexander's genuine transformation remained, for the time being, still unanswered. In the weeks that followed, Alexander began the difficult work of arranging the public acknowledgement Alina had requested, though he found the task considerably more complicated than he had first anticipated. A simple private letter would not suffice, nor would a quiet word dropped carefully into the county's gossip network, allowing Lady Beatrice Hartley to spread a softened version of events at her own discretion. Elinor had asked for honesty delivered with the same public weight as the original cruelty, and Alexander understood that anything less would fail to meet the standard she had rightfully set. He considered several approaches before settling on the county's upcoming winter assembly, an annual gathering that drew nearly every prominent family within the region, including many who had witnessed his original cruelty at the altar 2 years earlier. It seemed the most complete answer to Elinor's condition, a public setting equivalent in scale to the wedding he had destroyed, where he could speak plainly and completely without the protection of private correspondence or careful intermediaries. He informed his father of the plan with some trepidation, uncertain how Edward would receive the risk to whatever remained of the family's fragile reputation. "You intend to stand before the entire assembly and admit the full truth of what happened," Edward said slowly, considering the plan with evident concern. "Alexander, consider carefully what this might cost us. We have spent 2 years quietly rebuilding what trust remains. This could undo all of it in a single evening." "I am aware of the risk," Alexander said. "But I gave Elinor my word, father, and I do not intend to offer her another half-measure, another convenient apology delivered where the cost to myself remains minimal. If genuine change requires this sacrifice, then I am prepared to make it, regardless of what it costs our family's remaining reputation." Edward studied his son for a long moment, and slowly, something like pride began to replace the concern in his expression. "Your grandfather would have called that foolish," he said finally. "I confess I am beginning to call it something closer to honorable, however much I fear the consequences." Alexander spent the following weeks preparing carefully for the assembly, drafting and redrafting the words he intended to speak, determined that, when the moment finally arrived, he would offer nothing less than the complete, unflinching truth Elinor deserved. He did not inform her directly of his plan, uncertain whether advance warning would help or hinder the sincerity of what he intended to do, though he suspected, given how thoroughly gossip traveled through the county, that word of his intentions would reach her regardless before the assembly itself arrived. Elinor did indeed hear rumors in the days leading up to the winter assembly, fragments of speculation suggesting the Duke intended some significant announcement at the gathering, though no one seemed entirely certain of the details. She found herself unable to determine whether to attend at all, torn between curiosity about what Alexander might actually say, and a lingering caution against allowing herself to be drawn once more into a public spectacle involving his family's reputation. "You should attend," Charlotte advised, when Elinor raised the dilemma over their evening tea. "Whatever happens, you deserve to witness it directly rather than receiving only second-hand accounts, filtered through Lady Beatrice's considerable exaggeration." "And if he fails to meet the standard I set for him?" Elinor asked. "If his courage falters before the entire assembly, exactly as it once did the courage to simply speak with me honestly before our wedding day?" "Then you will have your answer," Charlotte said simply, "clearly and completely, in front of the same witnesses who saw him fail you the first time. There is a certain justice in that, Elinor, regardless of which way the evening unfolds." Elinor considered her friend's words carefully, recognizing the wisdom within them. Whatever happened at the winter assembly, she would finally have clarity, one way or another, about which version of Alexander Ashworth represented the truth of his character. She decided, after several days of careful deliberation, that she would attend, though she made no promises to herself about how she might respond to whatever unfolded that evening. The winter assembly hall glowed with candlelight when Elinor arrived, dressed in deep blue velvet that suited the season, her composure carefully gathered despite the uncertainty churning beneath the surface. Charlotte walked beside her, offering silent support as they entered the crowded room, filled with the same faces that had once witnessed her humiliation at the altar 2 years earlier. The whispers began almost immediately, though they carried a different quality than Elinor remembered from that terrible wedding day. Where once the county had whispered pity and scandal, They now whispered curiosity and, in some cases, genuine admiration, word of her thriving business having spread widely enough that many attendees greeted her with warmth rather than the careful distance she had once endured. She found a place near the edge of the grand room, close enough to observe clearly whatever unfolded but distant enough to maintain the composure she suspected she might need before the evening concluded. Across the room she caught sight of Alexander, standing near his father, his expression carefully composed though she could see, even from a distance, the tension held tightly in his shoulders. The assembly proceeded through its usual formalities, music and conversation filling the grand room as the evening progressed, and Alina began to wonder whether Alexander intended to follow through with whatever plan the rumors had suggested, or whether his courage had failed him once more at the crucial moment. Nearly an hour passed before he finally stepped forward, requesting a brief pause in the music, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quieting room. "I ask your patience for a few moments," Alexander said, standing at the center of the grand room where every eye could easily find him. "I have something I must say, and I find I can no longer bear to delay it any further." The room fell into complete silence, guests exchanging curious glances, many recognizing immediately the significance of the moment, remembering clearly the last occasion this particular family had drawn such widespread attention at a public gathering. "2 years ago," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the evident difficulty of the words, "many of you witnessed a moment I have spent every day since regretting. I stood before Miss Alina Whitmore at what should have been our wedding, and rather than facing my own fear and cowardice honestly, I chose instead to humiliate her publicly, destroying her reputation and her happiness in a single cruel moment, for reasons that had far more to do with my own weakness than any genuine fault of hers." A murmur moved through the crowd, and Alina felt every eye in the room beginning to shift toward her, though she kept her attention fixed steadily on Alexander, refusing to let the weight of public attention shake her composure. "I told myself at the time that I was acting out of love," Alexander continued. "I told myself I was sparing Miss Whitmore a lifetime of unhappiness bound to a husband who did not choose her freely. The truth, which I have spent these past 2 years slowly and painfully coming to understand, is considerably less noble than that story I told myself. I was simply afraid, and rather than facing that fear with honesty, I chose the easiest and most cowardly path available to me, regardless of the devastating cost to an innocent woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment." He paused, his gaze finding Alina across the crowded room, and though his voice wavered slightly, he continued without breaking away from her steady, watchful expression. "Miss Whitmore has since built a life and a business through her own extraordinary talent and determination, succeeding entirely on her own merits, despite the considerable damage my cruelty caused her. She owes this county no explanation for anything that happened that day, and she certainly owes me nothing, neither forgiveness nor further patience with my belated attempts at making amends. I stand before you all tonight not to ask for her forgiveness publicly, which would be an unfair burden to place upon her in front of so many witnesses, but simply to correct the record honestly, exactly as I once distorted it so cruelly. Whatever anyone in this room believed about that day, know now that the fault was entirely mine, that Miss Whitmore behaved with more grace and dignity in that terrible moment than I have managed to demonstrate in the 2 years since, and that I am, and remain, entirely responsible for the pain my cowardice caused her." The room remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, the weight of his public confession settling over the gathered guests. Lady Beatrice Hartley, for perhaps the first time in living memory, found herself entirely without a ready remark, her expression caught somewhere between shock and grudging respect. Alina stood very still amid the silence, her heart beating rapidly despite her carefully maintained composure. She had asked for this, had set this condition deliberately, understanding the risk it carried for Alexander's remaining reputation. She had not fully anticipated, however, how it would feel to actually witness him fulfill it, standing before the entire county and accepting complete responsibility without any attempt to soften or excuse his original cruelty. She became aware, gradually, that the room was waiting for some response from her, though Alexander had made no direct request of her, had asked for nothing beyond the opportunity to correct the record honestly. She considered remaining silent, simply allowing his words to stand as they were. A private understanding settled quietly between the two of them despite the public setting. But something in his expression, something in the genuine vulnerability he had displayed by standing before the entire assembly and accepting such complete responsibility, moved her to speak. "Thank you, Your Grace," Elinor said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room, "for finally telling the truth 2 years later than it was owed, but told completely nonetheless." A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the gathered crowd at her response, and Elinor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her once more, though this time the attention carried none of the pity or scandal she remembered from her wedding day. This time she stood beneath that attention with her composure entirely intact, a woman who had built her own success and now stood, by her own choice, addressing the man who had once tried to define her future without her consent. "I do not offer forgiveness tonight," she continued, "because forgiveness is not something that can be granted in a single public moment, however sincere the confession that precedes it. But I acknowledge that what you have done tonight required genuine courage, and I am willing, going forward, to judge your future conduct on its own merits, rather than continuing to measure you solely against the cruelty of that terrible day." Alexander crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance from her, close enough to speak without shouting across the assembly but far enough to respect the boundary her words had carefully established. "That is more than I hoped for tonight," he said quietly, though his voice carried clearly in the hushed room. "I do not ask for anything more than the opportunity you have just offered." "Then earn it," Elinor said simply, slowly, honestly, without expectation of reward. "I have built a life that no longer requires your approval to feel complete, Alexander. If there is ever to be anything further between us, it will be because you have proven, through sustained and genuine effort, that you have become a man worthy of standing beside the woman I have become, not because a single evening's confession, however brave, erases 2 years of consequence." "I understand," Alexander said, "and I accept those terms gladly, whatever the outcome eventually proves to be." The assembly slowly resumed its usual rhythm around them, music beginning again, conversation gradually filling the room once more, though Elinor suspected the evening's events would be discussed throughout the county for weeks to come, this time carrying an entirely different quality than the gossip that had once followed her humiliation. She left the gathering that night without any firm promise beyond her willingness to observe, but walking home beside Charlotte through the cold winter air, she found herself considering, for the first time in 2 years, that perhaps the story was not yet fully written, that perhaps some form of genuine reconciliation, built slowly and honestly rather than granted in a single dramatic moment, might yet be possible between them. The following months tested Alexander's resolve considerably. He continued his work within the shipping trade, steadily rebuilding his family's finances through honest labor rather than convenient shortcuts. He attended social gatherings sparingly, avoiding any appearance of using his public confession as a means of quickly restoring his social standing. He wrote to Elinor occasionally, brief and modest letters asking after her business rather than pressing for any romantic response, content to let whatever relationship might develop between them grow at whatever pace she required. Elinor, for her part, watched his sustained effort with careful, patient attention, neither encouraging false hope nor dismissing his genuine progress. She continued expanding Whitmore Blooms, opening a third location by the following spring, her reputation as one of the region's most successful independent businesswomen growing steadily with each passing month. She maintained her friendship with Henry, grateful that their honest conversation had preserved a genuine, uncomplicated fondness between them, even after the romantic possibility between them had quietly closed. It was nearly a year after the winter assembly, on a warm afternoon in early summer, that Alexander finally found the courage to ask Elinor a question he had been carefully avoiding throughout the slow, patient months of their gradual reconciliation. He found her in her greenhouse, tending the same roses and lavender that had first sparked her business years earlier, and he stood quietly in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed his presence. "I did not expect to see you here," Elinor said, setting down her gardening tools, though her tone carried genuine warmth rather than surprise. "I have thought carefully about how to ask this," Alexander said, "and I find there is no way to make the question smaller or less significant than it actually is. Elinor, I have spent this past year attempting to prove, through every honest means available to me, that I have become a different man than the one who left you at that altar. I do not ask you to forget what happened, nor to pretend the past 2 years did not occur. I only ask whether you believe, after everything you have witnessed of my genuine effort, that there might now be room for something more between us, built honestly this time, on terms entirely of your choosing." Elinor studied him carefully, considering the year of patient, sustained proof he had offered, weighing it against the 2 years of hard-won independence she had built entirely on her own terms. She thought of the frightened bride who had once stood frozen at that altar, and the confident businesswoman who now stood before him in her thriving greenhouse, no longer needing his approval or his love to feel whole, but perhaps, finally, ready to consider whether she wanted them regardless. "I believe," Elinor said slowly, "that you have earned the right to ask that question honestly, which is considerably more than I could have said a year ago. I am not yet certain what my answer will be, Alexander, but I am willing, for the first time since that terrible day, to genuinely consider it." It was not the answer he had hoped for, but it was, he understood immediately, considerably more than he had any right to expect, and he accepted it with the same patient gratitude that had come to define his entire year of careful, honest effort. Whatever the future eventually held between them, Alexander understood that the woman standing before him in her greenhouse owed him nothing beyond the honest consideration she had just offered, and he intended to continue earning every measure of trust and affection she might one day be willing to grant him, for as long as that process required. Weeks passed after that quiet conversation in the greenhouse, and Alexander did not press her further, understanding that genuine consideration required time he had no right to rush. He continued his steady work, his careful correspondence, his patient presence at the edges of her life without ever demanding more than she was prepared to offer. Elinor, meanwhile, found herself thinking of him with increasing frequency, no longer the anxious circling thoughts of uncertainty that had troubled her after the gala, but something steadier, more settled, a quiet recognition that the man now consistently present in her life bore little resemblance to the one who had once humiliated her so completely. She spoke with Charlotte often during those weeks, working through the tangled feelings that had accompanied 2 years of hard-won independence now, standing alongside a genuine, growing affection she had not expected to feel again. "I am frightened," Elinor admitted one evening, the two friends sharing tea in the small office behind the original Whitmore Bloom's shop. "Not of him exactly, not anymore. I am frightened of what it might mean to want him again, after everything I built specifically because I believed I no longer needed anyone." "Wanting him does not undo what you built," Charlotte said gently. "You are not the same woman who once needed a marriage to feel secure, Elinor. You have built an entire life that exists independently of any man's presence. If you choose to let Alexander into that life now, it will be a choice made from strength, not desperation. That is an entirely different foundation than the one you stood upon 2 years ago." Elinor considered her friend's words carefully, recognizing the truth within them. She was no longer the frightened bride who had once needed Alexander's approval to feel her future was secure. She was a woman who had built her own security, her own reputation, her own thriving success, entirely through her own hands. Whatever she chose now, regarding Alexander or anyone else, would be chosen freely, not out of necessity. That understanding settled something within her, and on a bright morning in late summer, nearly 14 months after the Winter Assembly, where Alexander had first stood before the county and accepted full responsibility for his cruelty, Elinor sent word requesting his presence at the greenhouse where their conversation had first reopened the possibility between them. He arrived within the hour, his expression carefully composed despite the evident hope he could not entirely conceal. "You asked to see me," Alexander said, standing once more in the doorway of the greenhouse, sunlight filtering through the glass panes above them, illuminating the roses and lavender that had first launched Elinar's remarkable journey. "I have considered your question carefully," Elinar said, setting down her gardening tools and turning to face him directly. "I have watched you these past 14 months, Alexander, not simply through the lens of that one brave confession at the assembly, but through every small, consistent choice you have made since. The honest work, the patient distance you maintained when I asked for it, the genuine respect you have shown for the life I built without you. I believe, as completely as I am capable of believing anything, that the change in you is real." Alexander said nothing, waiting, understanding instinctively that she was not yet finished. "I am not the woman who once stood at that altar, waiting for you to choose her," Elinar continued. "I do not need you, Alexander, not for my security, not for my happiness, not for anything my own hands have not already provided. But I find, after everything, that I want you regardless, which I believe is a considerably stronger foundation than need ever could have been." "Then you are saying," Alexander began, hardly daring to finish the question. "I am saying," Elinar said, a genuine smile finally breaking across her composed expression, "that I am willing to consider a future between us, built honestly this time, as equals, on terms we determine together rather than terms forced upon either of us by desperate fathers or frightened choices. I make no promise of how quickly that future might unfold, Alexander, but I am no longer closing the door you spent 14 months proving you deserve to walk through." Alexander crossed the small distance between them, his expression carrying a depth of genuine relief and gratitude that no careful composure could fully contain. "That is more than I dared hope for," he said quietly. "I promise you, Elinar, whatever pace this requires, whatever proof you continue to need, I will provide it gladly for as long as it takes." "I know," Elinar said simply. "That is precisely why I am willing to try." Word of their reconciliation spread through the county, with considerably more warmth than the scandal that had originally brought them together in whispered gossip 2 years earlier. Lady Beatrice Hartley, ever attentive to a good story, found herself telling this particular tale with genuine enthusiasm rather than cruel amusement, describing to anyone who would listen the remarkable transformation of the Duke who had once humiliated his bride, and eventually earned her back through nothing but patient, honest effort. Elinar did not abandon her business for this new chapter of her life, nor did Alexander ever ask her to. Whitmore Blooms continued expanding under her direct management, its reputation growing steadily throughout the region, while Alexander continued his own honest work rebuilding what remained of his family's fortune, no longer through convenient marriages or inherited privilege, but through the same patient labor that had first proven his genuine transformation to the woman he had once so carelessly wronged. They were married the following spring, in a small, quiet ceremony attended only by close family and friends, entirely unlike the grand, public spectacle of their first attempted wedding. Elinar wore a simple gown scented faintly with her own fragrance, the same blend she had once named Renewal, and when Alexander spoke his vows this time, his voice carried none of the coldness that had once shattered her future in front of hundreds of witnesses. It carried instead a steady, genuine devotion, earned slowly and completely, exactly as she had once demanded, and finally fully given. 3 years after their quiet spring wedding, Elinar stood once more in the greenhouse that had first launched her remarkable transformation. Though the small structure had grown considerably since those early difficult days, expanded twice over to accommodate the flourishing varieties of flowers that supplied not only Whitmore Blooms, but a growing number of fragrance houses across several counties who now sought Elinar's expertise directly. The business had grown beyond anything she could have imagined during those early months of quiet grief and determined reinvention. Whitmore Blooms now operated 5 locations throughout the region, employed nearly 30 women in various roles from cultivation to sales, and had recently begun exporting select fragrances to buyers as far as the capital itself. a level of success that had once seemed impossibly distant from the humiliated bride, who had walked away from that cathedral with nothing but a determined resolve, and a talent for flowers she had barely recognized in herself. Alexander had proven himself, in the years since their marriage, precisely the steady partner he had promised to become. His work within the shipping trade had grown into a genuine, respected career, and though he had eventually inherited his father's title upon Edward's peaceful passing 2 years into their marriage, he had insisted on maintaining his independent work alongside his new responsibilities, unwilling to return entirely to a life of inherited privilege after everything he had learned about the value of honest labor. "You are thinking of something," Charlotte observed one afternoon, finding Aline lost in quiet reflection among the greenhouse's fragrant rows. Charlotte had become not only Aline's closest friend but her formal business partner in recent years, her sharp mind for correspondence and management proving invaluable as Whitmore Blooms continued its remarkable expansion. "I am thinking of how far we have traveled," Aline admitted, "from that terrible day at the altar to everything we have built since. It still surprises me sometimes how completely a single humiliation can become, eventually, the foundation of something far better than what it destroyed." "You built that foundation yourself," Charlotte reminded her gently. "Alexander earned his way back into your life, but the life itself, the business, the reputation, the independence, all of that belonged entirely to you before he ever proved himself worthy of sharing it." Aline smiled at her friend's characteristic bluntness, recognizing the truth within it. She had never regretted, in the years since her marriage, insisting that Alexander earn his place beside her rather than simply assuming it as his due, as he once had so carelessly at the altar. Their marriage, built on that foundation of proven honesty and mutual respect, bore little resemblance to the arranged, transactional match their families had originally intended, and Aline found herself grateful, in a strange and complicated way, for the painful path that had led them here. Henry Sinclair remained a close family friend in the years that followed, his shipping business often working alongside Alexander's own ventures, and he eventually found genuine happiness with a widow from a neighboring county, a match that Aline celebrated wholeheartedly, glad to see the patient kindness he had once offered her finally rewarded with the devotion he deserved. Lady Cassandra Blackwood's marriage to Lord Ainslie, meanwhile, had proven considerably less fortunate than she had likely anticipated, the union dissolving into quiet, well-documented unhappiness within a few short years, a development that reached Aline's ears through the same efficient gossip network that had once carried news of her own humiliation. She felt no particular satisfaction in the news, having long since released whatever lingering resentment she once held toward the woman who had, in her own way, contributed to the painful chapter that eventually led her toward everything she had built. The greatest joy of those years, however, arrived not through business success or social vindication, but through the quiet, ordinary moments of a marriage built genuinely on equal footing. Alexander never again made a significant decision without consulting Aline directly, remembering clearly the cost of choices made unilaterally without regard for another person's voice in the matter. Aline, in turn, found herself trusting him more completely with each passing year, watching him consistently choose honesty over convenience, patience over impulse, in every circumstance that tested his character. They welcomed their first child 2 years into the marriage, a daughter they named Rose, in gentle acknowledgement of the flowers that had first given Aline her independence, and eventually, indirectly, led her back to the man who had once tried to destroy her future. Alexander proved a devoted father, present for every small milestone in a way that surprised even himself, having grown up with a father whose own duties and financial worries had often kept him distant during Alexander's own childhood. "I want her to grow up understanding that her worth was never determined by anyone else's opinion of her," Aline told Alexander one evening, watching him gently rock their daughter to sleep in the nursery they had decorated with delicate floral patterns reminiscent of the greenhouse where their own reconciliation had finally taken root. "She will understand that," Alexander said quietly, "because she will grow up watching her mother, who built an entire empire from nothing but talent and determination, refusing every single day to let anyone else's cruelty define her worth. Elinor smiled at that, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched their daughter finally drift into peaceful sleep. She thought in that quiet moment of the terrified young bride who had once stood frozen at that altar, humiliated in front of hundreds of witnesses, uncertain whether her life held any purpose beyond the marriage that had just been so cruelly denied her. She thought of the long, difficult months that followed, the greenhouse that became her sanctuary, the shop that became her legacy, the slow and painful process of rebuilding herself entirely on her own terms. She thought, finally, of the man beside her now, so different from the cruel stranger who had once refused her at the altar, a man who had spent years proving, through patient and consistent honesty, that genuine change was possible, that people could grow beyond their worst mistakes if they were willing to do the difficult, humbling work required to earn that growth honestly. Whitmore Blooms continued to flourish in the years that followed, its reputation eventually extending well beyond the county where it had first taken root in a small greenhouse, tended by a grieving young woman determined to build something no one could ever take from her again. Elinor never forgot the painful lesson that had launched her remarkable journey, but she no longer carried it as a wound. She carried it instead as the foundation of everything she had eventually built, proof that even the most devastating humiliation could become, with enough patience and determination, simply the beginning of an entirely different and far more remarkable story. On quiet evenings, when the greenhouse grew fragrant with the day's final blooming, and the county had long since settled into peaceful darkness, Elinor would sometimes walk among her flowers, remembering the frightened young woman who had first sought refuge there, and feeling, with quiet and complete certainty, genuine gratitude for everything that difficult, painful path had eventually taught her. She had learned that a woman's worth was never dependent upon a man's approval, that humiliation could become the seed of remarkable reinvention, and that genuine love, when it finally arrived honestly and completely, was worth infinitely more than the convenient, arranged affection she had once believed was the very best she could hope to receive. The Duke who had once publicly rejected his bride had, in the end, become the husband who publicly honored her, standing beside her not as a man who had rescued her from ruin, but as a man who had finally proven himself worthy of standing beside the extraordinary woman she had become entirely on her own. And Elinor, who had once walked away from a cathedral in silent, dignified devastation, walked now through her own thriving greenhouse as exactly what she had always deserved to be. Not merely a duchess, but the architect of her own remarkable and thoroughly well-earned happiness.